Well, great. With that, we can go ahead and get started. So today's lecture is going to be on impromptu prep in world schools. It's something that is very scary, especially for people getting right into world schools debate, because you have an hour to basically prepare for a whole debate with zero internet, which is not fun to say the least, but there's some strategies that can make it a lot easier and can make it actually very, very successful. But before we get that, just a little bit about me, because I'm not usually here. So if you guys don't know me, I do know what I'm talking about. And if you do know me, here's just like maybe some things you don't know. So I was on Team USA this past year. So we competed domestically at tournaments like Greenhill and Harvard-Westlake, both of which we won. And internationally in tournaments like the Winter Holiday Open. We competed in Hong Kong. We went to Singapore and Mexico, and most notably, we went to Vietnam over the summer and became WSD champions for the first time in international history. So really big deal for us. That we never thought the United States would win because other countries kind of hate on us a lot, but we did it, and it was a very, very successful year. So I know what I'm talking about when it comes to impromptu prep. But beyond that, like the reason I got involved in world schools is because I have a very big background in congressional debate, which is probably where I'm most known individually. I was a NSDA finalist for the past 2 years, and my junior year in 2023, I was the top ranked female across both houses, where I ranked third. So I have a lot of coaching experience. Debate is something that's very meaningful to me. I've coached at the Global Debate Symposium for Worlds. I've coached at NCI, which is a National Congress Institute. I coached there over the summer. I also do some private coaching, stuff like that. So debate has been like a part of me my whole life. I've gotten pretty far with it, and I'm really, really excited to keep being involved in the community however I can. So hopefully this helps you guys out. Okay, so just to give you guys a little bit of a lesson overview, we're going to talk about 4 things today, and then we'll do a little Q&A. So first, we're just going to like very briefly go over what impromptu prep is, what sets apart an impromptu round from a regular round, just like the very, very basic intro stuff. Then we're going to get into the really, really nitty-gritty parts of it, which is how should we be using our time, because it's an hour, which seems like a lot when you're like thinking of it and conceptualizing it. When you're in a round, you have to write an 8-minute speech, think of rebuttals, think of answers to those rebuttals, think of weighing, think of round strategy. And all of this is written by hand, unless you're in an online tournament, of course. But especially when it's written by hand, it becomes really, really hard to allocate your time well. And there's also tournaments where you only get like 45 minutes. So making sure that your time strategy is good is what's going to set you up for the most success. So that's going to be the second thing we talk about. Then we'll go over what individual members should do, because not everybody can be working on the same thing all at once. Otherwise, you're not going to finish. So kind of talking about different roles for different people. And then finally, we're going to talk about what you can do to set yourself apart, because the way international teams like Team USA, Team Canada do impromptu prep is very different than the way another team might do it. And it's really these kind of communication strategies that I would say set us apart and make us really successful. And we'll end with a little Q&A. I'll try and leave time, but yeah. So first, just like very briefly, we'll talk about what impromptu prep is, because there's a difference between prepared rounds and impromptu rounds. Prepared rounds are when you get like practically unlimited time leading up to a tournament to prep your cases. It's like pretty much, it's like LD or policy or even Congress, where you know what you're talking about when you walk into the room. Impromptu prep or impromptu rounds are like throughout a tournament, you're going to get rounds where you're not going to know what you're going to be talking about until an hour before you debate. And in that hour, you get no internet access, just your team, and you have to come up with a case and you have to be ready to debate. I would say the most jarring part about it is the lack of internet access. If you have a background in extemp, that really helps. But yeah, main difference between prepared and impromptu rounds, everything is the same except for the level of preparation you get to do before going into the tournament. So yeah, first thing we're going to talk about is you have an hour. You have to use your time wisely, and you have to split it up in a very specific way. I would say a lot of teams do things differently, but out of all the international teams that I've met, talked to, competed with, competed against, we all tend to use this way to split up time. So the first 5 minutes are really, really important. What you want to do is silent prep. You don't want to speak a word to another teammate. It doesn't matter if you have no idea what the topic is about. Start writing something on paper. It doesn't matter if it's stupid. Just think about what the topic could possibly mean and start thinking for those first 5 minutes. Because the thing you really want to avoid is groupthink, where you guys, one person will say their idea and then that one idea dictates the rest of the conversation and dictates the direction of your case. When if you had taken that 5 minutes to silently prep and have everybody come up with their own argument, you could have a lot more of a nuanced case and could have a lot more effective argumentation. So those first 5 minutes need to be silent prep. It doesn't matter. Like, I know it's very stressful to think like you're wasting time just sitting there like in deep introspection, but it's actually necessary. The next 10 to 15 minutes are going to be on a discussion of arguments. So what we do is we go around, and usually there'll be an appointed team captain. We'll talk a little bit more about specific roles later, but usually there'll be an appointed team captain or a moderator, and they'll have each person, ending with themselves, go around and share their thoughts. So maybe they have thoughts on framing, maybe they have thoughts on principle, maybe they have thoughts on argumentation. What you really want to focus on is the core of like arguments. So you don't want to be thinking about things like opposing arguments or like what you want these subs to be. You want to be thinking about like specific individual points. Because if you're focusing on things like this is what the framework needs to be, this is what I think the other people are going to say, this is how I think our sub should be split up, then you're going to get confused and you're not going to be able to recognize anybody else's ideas. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just focus on like the claim part of the argument a lot. Like, don't really focus too much on the warrants and impacts. Focus on the general claim you're trying to get out for those 10 to 15 minutes. Everybody will go around and share. Then the next 10 to 15 minutes, hopefully less, but generally with 10 to 15 minutes, are going to be focusing on the case split. So what you do there is you group together arguments that are similar, arguments that are strong that you like, that stand out to you, that you think are going to be able to outweigh your opponents. And then you're going to try and group those into your subs. So if you have like a lot on principle, you can group those together and form a principle, find a unifying theme to name your principle, or just say principle and then go into it. And then you might have practical, and you have like 3 warrants and 3 claims that you think are really strong on the practical harms or the practical benefits of the topic. And then you're going to break those into a second sub. And then your third will probably be something a little bit more nuanced, something that's a little bit shorter, but can have like a good impact. Usually third subs will get dropped. That's increasingly becoming common. Some teams don't even use them. I would say still use them, still in the rules. But if especially if you're on op, the third sub will likely get dropped. So it's like there, and it needs to be true and logical, but can be a little bit more nuanced. Then you're going to go into what we'll be talking about for the bulk of the lecture, which is what you do in these 25 minutes after you set the case, you know what the subs are going to be, and you go into split into individual jobs. So there's stuff like clash, there's stuff like people coming up with illustrations, there's people thinking of A2s, stuff like that. Really short amount of time, you're going to get the whole case written. Then for the last 5 minutes, if you have more, I would say like the absolute minimum amount of time you can do this is 3 minutes, but ideally it'd be around 5. You need to reconvene with the other members of your team and talk about strategy, because if you're disjointed in your strategy, your speeches aren't going to create a logical flow throughout the round, and you're going to contradict each other, and then it's just not going to be a strong round. So that's how you should split up your time. But what do we do in round when we're actually prepping? When we have this time memorized, we can practice it, but when we actually have a topic and we need to be writing a case, what do we do? So the first thing that's really, really important is you need to go in the round having some idea of who's going to be responsible for what. There's a lot of jobs that we're going to talk about in impromptu prep, but you have an hour. You can accomplish a lot in that hour. You need to have people with jobs who are going to execute that job. Otherwise, you'd have like 2 people doing the same thing and 1 thing not being done at all. This can look different for a lot of teams, but there's two general rules that I think are most necessary, and that's the moderator and the devil's advocate. This was actually something that was introduced to us by the coach of Team Canada while we were in Mexico City, kind of talking about team rules. I want to preface this by saying that teams do this differently, and you can try this, and if you don't like it, don't do it. USA, what we did was we kind of fell into these roles and had people carry them out, but it was more split. We didn't like go into a round and say like assigned, you're the moderator, you're the devil's advocate, XYZ. Usually there was like a team captain and they would largely serve as the moderator unofficially, but these are just roles that need to be filled. We don't assign them. Team Canada assigns them. They live by that. I would try it out, see if it works for your team, and go from there. There's just some people that are more naturally suited to moderating. Some people who are more naturally suited to coming up with rebuttal arguments. So I think that leaning into that, well, I mean, if you watch the finals of WSCC, ended up working out for us a little bit better, at least this year. So what the moderator does is keep prep on track. They delegate. They interrupt if you get off track, if one person is talking for too long, keeping everybody on track, etc. This should probably be not the first speaker. It should probably be a second or third speaker, somebody who isn't debating, because the first speaker is really, really focused on the case. So it could be somebody who is able to like kind of flip between groups and make sure everything's getting done. The devil's advocate is trying to figure out the best responses to your material and make the team aware of them, because one of the strongest things you can do in impromptu prep and in writing any case is weave in responses to your opponents within the case so that that argumentation, that impact is coming from the one. And then you have like a really, really good line of team unity from the first speech, and that's going to be something that your judges are always going to notice. So the devil's advocate will be making the team aware of those from the very beginning, thinking of what are the obvious responses to our arguments. They're going to be honest about the extent to which something can be weighed in the round. So if you have an argument that you like, that you think is good, but it's very marginal, like maybe you want to talk about how a topic is going to impact indigenous communities in Latin America. That could be a really strong, really nuanced argument. It could be something that you bring into the third sub, but it's not going to be a round-winning argument. It's a little bit more marginal. So the devil's advocate is going to be thinking about weighing from the one, what are the arguments we're going to carry from our first speech and weigh all the way into the reply. Also, just a note here, not like super common, but one thing you need to make sure that you do or you don't do that I actually found that our team this year did quite a bit was that we would focus so much on the other side's arguments, on what they were going to say, that we kind of made the debate about their side. So instead of like accepting our strongest pieces of offense, we focused so much on defense that we made the round about their case, which is not that good in the eyes of the judge. Yeah, you want to really focus on weighing your strongest arguments. So yeah, that was a lot. But the next thing we'll talk about is what each speaker should be doing, because that is something that's assigned. The first speaker, case. Do not worry about anything else. You need to be writing that out. This is probably where I would say the non-speaking person, if you have one, would probably be, because there's simply so much to write. But there are a couple of things you need to consider when you're doing the one. You need to, first of all, make sure you understand what you're talking about. Somebody could come up, and especially when you're on a team that's like very, very high level, it's hard to explain. If you have an argument that other people might not understand, it's hard to explain it when you only have 30 seconds. So if you're explaining a very nuanced argument to the one and they don't get it, it's not going to come out in the case right. So as the one, something I had to learn, and I think every speaker should learn, is that you should ask questions. Like, your teammates aren't going to think you're dumb if you don't automatically understand everything that they're saying. And if you don't buy your argument, or if you don't understand your argument, it's going to show when you're delivering the case. So you shouldn't be running it. The next thing is the one should be separated from people talking clash. Like, get some physical distance there, sit at another table, lock in, but don't isolate yourself. Like, if you're on an online tournament, don't mute yourself and turn off the volume. Like, I had somebody do that once. Then you're not able to like pick up on a lot of the really, really important things that are happening around. Like the devil's advocate, say they come up with a really, really important piece of clash that you need to preempt from the one, you need to be available for that, but you should also not be so involved in the clash that you're not focused on writing the case. The second speaker needs to divide their time equally, I would say. First, they need to be writing the third sub because the first speaker can't write all of that. Like, that's insane. And the two is delivering the third sub. So again, they need to be able to understand it when they're delivering it and know how to weigh it. But they also really need to be focusing on simple rebuttals, A2s. What are they going to say? How do we respond? What are they going to say? How do we respond? Start weighing as well. The 2 and the 3 should really work very closely together here. The 2 more working on forming responses. The 3 more focusing on weighing. So the 3 should be looking at things like, what is the round going to break down to? How do we make our impacts the center of the round instead of theirs? And how do we outweigh their strongest ground? So something that I always like to do, and this will tie in a little bit when we talk about strategy, is ask, what's our strongest ground? What's our weakest ground? What's their strongest ground? What's their weakest ground? And what you want to do from here is make the debate about your strongest argument and their weakest argument. So that's what you're talking about the most. You're able to outweigh very easily. That doesn't always happen successfully, but it's something you always want to do, and you want to be able to know your path to the ballot, their path to the ballot, and how you're going to outweigh their path to the ballot, if that makes sense. So that's what the 2 and the 3 should really be doing, is focusing on reverse engineering the round, preempting responses, making sure everyone's very unified in their opposition. Yeah. And then there's the non-speaking person. The worst thing that this person can do in prep is just not contribute. This person can be essential for forming ideas at the outset, and then can also go in between groups wherever they're needed. So sometimes one person's a lot better at writing framing, one person's a lot better at writing impacts, one person's a lot better at writing out illustrations. And so if you have like a first speaker who isn't that good at framing and a non-speaker who's very good at framing, and the non-speaker isn't doing anything, then that's a very large missed opportunity. The non-speaking person should be there to fill whatever need the team has, and should be equally or more engaged than the rest of them, because like the prep is their time to contribute to the team. So yeah. The next thing we're going to discuss is the things that you need to be covering in prep, because obviously you need to be writing the case, you need to be preempting the arguments, you need talking strategy, all this. But if you don't know like everything you're supposed to be talking about, then you're going to forget something and you're going to regret it later. So having a plan to talk about, I'm pretty sure it's 4 things, that are really, really important for the round, are going to really set you apart as a team. The first thing is the case split. This will absorb a good half, hopefully it's less than half, but it absorbs a good portion of your impromptu prep, because first you're generating ideas, then you're getting all the ideas out there, brain dumping them, then you're organizing them, you're making framing, you're clarifying your stance, etc. So it all gets like very, very time consuming, but there's a couple things you need to focus on when you're making your case split. First is the stance. When you're looking at a motion and you're trying to figure out how you're going to be framing it throughout the round, throughout each speaker, you need to have a unified vision for your world characterization, for what you want your stance to look like. And so that's something you need to talk about together, because the case needs to be unified with that, the rebuttals need to be unified with that, the clash and the weighing. All of that needs to know what you're trying to set out to accomplish and what world you're defending. So an example here that I thought would be kind of fun to talk about was our final round in Mexico last year. They did a fun kind of motion that was like, this house would, it was a characterization, like there's a meteor hurtling towards the earth and is going to wipe humanity out of existence. This house would inform the public. So you had to either inform the public or not inform the public. And kind of what we had to figure out was, what is this world going to look like? Is the meteor going to get here in 2 days? Is it going to get here in 2 weeks? Does that make a difference? Yeah, you see what I'm saying there? Like, you have to kind of like make the motion make sense, but you also have to be very charitable here to your opponents. You can't say like, the meteor is here in 5 seconds, or something like that. You have to create a characterization that's favorable and charitable to your opponents. That's something that's very interesting about Worlds, is that you're really supposed to be nice to your opponents, which I like. Not as common in other debate events anymore, but you need to make sure that your stance is clear and is defendable. Another thing there on that is that you should always be carrying a pure stance. So for this motion of at the end of the world, you wouldn't want to say on either side something like, oh, we would tell some people, like, oh, we would tell all the government officials across the world, or we would tell all the scientists to see if they can stop it, something like that. You would want to either tell everyone or tell no one. That's something that I actually personally had a hard time adjusting to, because I was so used to in Congress, like doing little Congress counter plans, like getting in very nuanced ways to affirm or negate something. In Worlds, you're either a hard yes or a hard no, so you need to clarify what that looks like and be able to defend it. The next thing there is combining ideas. So you want to form your subs with the strongest and the most common ideas. So you don't want to ignore easy things to think of. Like on any motion, you don't want to like ignore the most obvious piece of argumentation because you're so focused on like coming up with something like really clever. So make sure you have like these common easy wins in there, and then also form your subs out of the strongest arguments. Usually what that looks like in like a this house would motion is you'll probably have like a principle and then a practical. Always put the principle first. But if you have like something like an actor motion, there might not be a principle. So just organize it with a very logical flow of ideas. Like if one makes more sense first, put that first. If one's stronger, maybe put that first, and put this less strong one second. And then if you have something a little bit more marginal and nuanced, put that in the third step. The whole idea here is everybody is sharing their ideas. You're considering and hearing them all, and you're picking the strongest ones and grouping them together. So an example here is our Hong Kong tournament. We had a topic on this house would prohibit all financial settlements and environmental lawsuits. So here I put 3 arguments that we came up with, which is like we are on op. Yes, sorry. We are on op here. So we wanted no. Wait, yes, we are on up. Yeah. So we wanted to prohibit all financial settlements. So we wanted all environmental lawsuits to go to court. So 3 of us came up with different argumentation here. One was media publicity, which is like if they're going to court, they get more media publicity, and then they have like an incentive to reform their practices. The next was setting a precedent, which was like we don't have to win all cases, but the ones that we do win will set a future precedent for environmental lawsuits, meaning victims will be able to successfully sue in the future. The first case we win will set a precedent forever. Be very impactful. The last one someone came up with was deterrence, which is like if there's a threat of having to go to court and they know that they'll like risk losing investors, they'll risk being in the spotlight, getting canceled on social media, they'll be less likely to pursue harmful practices because they don't want people to see them. So those were 3 separate arguments we came up with. And if one person had said like, okay, we're going straightforward media publicity, and we had made that a sub, sure, it could have been strong. But what we ended up doing was grouping all these together under a practical harms of financial settlements sub, and we got to hit all 3. And so that made our argument a lot more well-rounded instead of just like having one idea dominate the conversation. So yeah. Next then is the idea of clash. So what you want to talk about here is this is the most important thing in any debate. You don't want 2 ships sailing past each other in the night or whatever that saying is, but you want to make sure that you're engaging with your opponents from the first speech. So even in a prop 1, like you should have things woven in there that are going to preempt what your opponent is saying. That's probably in the framing, like we defend a world in which XYZ, this is going to be far better than the ops world, which is ABC. So clash is something that you should be carrying throughout, especially important in the 2, but people focusing on clash need to be asking, what is the other side going to run, and how are we going to respond to that? One thing to be very, very careful about is to not rely on the things that you come up with in the prep round. because if you're only going off the A2s that you have written down, then you could miss some nuance in their argumentation, and then you're not fully addressing it, because everything's not like you can reverse engineer around for hours and you're still not going to be able to capture perfectly exactly what your opponent is saying. So like I'm trying to think of a good example here, but let's just say, yeah, I can't think of an exact example for how it can be different, but if you just like blanket their argumentation into something you already have an answer to, your answer probably won't fully address what they're talking about. Oh yeah, I have an example here. So my example here is from Singapore round 6. So this one was like this house would take international action against people. I'm trying to find the exact wording of it. Yeah, this house in the fight against climate change would take international action against countries which allows environmental abuses through direct actions or negligence. Yeah, so one thing that we needed to do here was preempt their argumentation. So what we had to do is you should not be putting your opponent into a box that they're not actually going to stay in. For example, your opponent isn't going to look at this and say, oh, we don't need to take action against climate change because climate change isn't real. If you prep arguments against that, you're not going to be successful. You need to be putting yourself into the eyes of your opponents and thinking about reasonable, probable stances that they would actually take, because otherwise you're not going to end up using your A2s at all. I would say that also applies to like very feminist things that you might get. Like if there's anything about like, I don't know, maybe some kind of protest, or like maybe anything related to like race or feminism. The chances that you get somebody who goes up there and says something like very, very misogynistic or very, very racist is very rare, because debaters are largely more liberal. So like, for example, this is an example from Congress, but if you have a topic on something like felon voting, the odds you're gonna have somebody come up and say like felons don't deserve the right to vote because like they're not on the same level as regular citizens. The chances you can hear an argument like that are very, very slim. So what you need to do is put yourself in your opponent's shoes and think of how you, if you were defending that side, would address the argument. So like they're not going to say something like climate change isn't real. They're probably going to say something like this is going to overwhelmingly hurt developing countries who didn't actually cause the climate situation we're in right now. Something like that. So you need to be prepared to engage with that, and also outweigh that. The next thing that's really, really important, that's the hardest part by far of impromptu prep, is illustrations. This is where topic knowledge is extremely important. This is probably, I would say, like with a lot of strategy is great, but if you don't have content knowledge, you're going to be debating hypotheticals, and hypotheticals are very, very easily outweighed by actual illustrations. So doing things like staying up with current events, reading literature, paying attention in history class even, like can help you out a lot during these rounds, and they can strengthen your arguments. So the example that the coach from Team Canada gave us here was like, if you have a round that's talking about like doctors should be able to perform emergency procedures on kids without parental consent in emergency situations. So that was the one they gave us, and they were like, you can talk about hypotheticals like, oh, the parents might not approve, or oh, it might go against like the family's beliefs or something like that. Or you can say, give a concrete example, like Jehovah's Witnesses don't allow surgical procedures, and that would be going against like the whole family's core set of beliefs. Or you could say something on proposition, like if this raises a patient's survival chance from 10 to 30%, it's worth taking that risk. Because one thing that's very important to realize is a lot of the weighing that you're going to be doing and a lot of the second half of the round is going to be less grounded in logic and like concrete examples, it's going to be more focused on impact. So if you can make your judge like see where you're coming from and like really see like the intuition behind, like one thing that the first day I did Worlds with USA, I heard the word intuitive about 12,000 times. Like after I left Mexico, I was like, if one more person says the word intuitive to me, I'm going to actually rip my head off. I was so sick of it. Then I started saying it and I started becoming part of the problem after that. But that's besides the point. It is really important that your judges are able to see that your arguments are grounded in logic. And if you're debating hypotheticals, once again, it's going to be a lot harder to defend your own stance, especially if your opponents come prepared. So make sure these are in the case. It's cool to be able to bring up examples later and really like impress your judges and wow in your rebuttal with like some really niche, impressive example, but you really want to be carrying them throughout the case and expanding throughout the round. So you want them in the one, carrying them throughout the round, because then your judge is able to see that your logic and your case is grounded in reality, in precedent, and in intuition. And then you're able to impact and weigh throughout the rest of the round. So the example I want to talk about here was Harvard-Westlake finals, which we won. So good example of how illustrations help you. It was an impromptu motion. It was this house regrets the rise of tech protectionism. So what we talked about was we wanted to talk about how it was really important for developing countries. We were on op here. We were talking about how it's really important for developing countries to have like technology. Wait, were we on prop here? I actually think we were on prop. Yeah, we were on prop. So we did regret the rise of tech protectionism. And so what we talked about was how important it was for countries in their development to have technology come into their borders. So our claim here was when developed countries engage in tech protectionism, they lose an incentive to build up the economies of developing countries. So we can say that, and that can be a hypothetical, and we can leave it at that. Or what we were able to come up with, which is very impressive. I will not take credit for this. I'll take credit for the second one, but not the first one. I think this was Vin probably who came up with this example. But he remembered that when Western countries were invited into China, like they created tech cities in Shanghai, Beijing, and they turned the cities from rural towns into technological megacities, really aid with their development. We also came up with the example of like this is the exact same process which India used to industrialize. So very industrialized, very powerful nations right now did not have tech protectionism, and as the result of technology spreading into their countries, they were able to develop. It boosted their economy, it grew their technological capabilities, and so what the impact here was that developing countries won't be able to develop, they won't be able to build up their economies, and kind of talking about the structural incentives of developed countries and tech protectionism. So having that example made our hypothetical into something that's grounded in history, something that's grounded in reality, and we didn't give one example, we gave two. So that was something that was able to be very successful for us. But illustrations are the thing that are most lacking in impromptu rounds. That is honestly what we say about Team USA in the past, is that our team very rarely loses impromptu rounds. And I think the reason for that is because we have a very large topic knowledge of a very wide set of things, because the US is so diverse and because all the members come from very different parts of the country. We know a lot about a lot of different things, and that might be very different than somewhere that's very homogenous. So something I would really emphasize here is if there's a topic that a member of your team is an expert on, like you can always shuffle things around a little bit. Like we had I think this was in Winter Holiday Open, but there was a round that was about feminism. And there were two girls on our team, and I wasn't supposed to be speaking. They put me in to speak because having more women talking about a feminist topic is more appealing to the judge, and that ended up well. And like you can do that. If somebody on your team knows more about something, has more topic knowledge, can provide more illustrations and their rebuttals and things like that, don't be afraid to shift it around. But yes. All that being said, illustrations, very, very important. Make sure you're reading up on topic knowledge. Make sure you're searching your brain to include those in the case and carry them and weigh them throughout the round, because that will make your arguments more intuitive. Last thing then is strategy. This is hard to do, especially when you're under a time crunch and you're worried about argumentation and rebuttals. This is like argumentation, rebuttals, writing the case is like very on the top. It's like everything you must do, very surface level. Being able to reverse engineer the round is a much deeper level of debate, and it's a strategy that you should get to and try to get to and practice in the time constraints. But what you want to do here is go from the end of the round and reverse engineer it. What are you trying to impact out to at the end of the round? What is your strongest argument that you want to carry, weigh throughout the round, and make it your path to the ballot? So that's something that we always ask ourselves in those last 5 minutes is, what's our strongest argument? What do we want to emphasize throughout the round? The next thing, like, what are the most important arguments in the round going to be? What is their most important argument? What is our most important argument? And find ways to defend yours and continue to outweigh and break down theirs. Because what really is going to matter far more than being able to refute something on like a very this isn't true level, or this doesn't matter level, or just on like a very rebuttal level, is going to be effective. But when you get to the reply, you're going to have very talented debaters on each side rebutting each other, going back and forth. So if the judge is going to be buying their side, even if that's going to be something you're going to be using a lot, even if what they're saying is true, it doesn't matter because what you're saying outweighs it. So you want to be able to do that with the strongest arguments of the round, take them at their highest ground, and outweigh them. So being able to see that end game is really going to help you from the start, because you're already seeing the end of the round from the beginning. What you want to focus on again there is you want to make your impacts and your weighing what the round is about. You want to make the focus of the round on your strongest arguments, and you want to kind of like, because in a something like Worlds where you start off with really, really long speeches and you end with a really, really short speech, things are going to have to get thrown out. So you want the things that the debate ends up focusing on to be your strongest argument, and you want theirs to kind of get tossed out. So you want to know what their strongest ground is, you want to outweigh it, and you want to make your impacts the center of the round. And the reason, this is all like basic world stuff. Like, this isn't unique to impromptu prep, but what is unique to impromptu prep is that you have an hour to talk about your strategy and write your case. So using those last 5 minutes to talk about strategy, to talk about what are we winning on, how are we winning this round, is essential. Because if you have 3 different ideas of what your path to the ballot is, then your entire round is going to be disjointed. If you're able to, from the 1 and carrying through the 4, emphasize and weigh the same things, and also like continuously outweigh in the same manner, it's going to stick in your judge's head. They're going to also weigh it as the strongest argument, because you're making the debate about that if you're starting to emphasize and weigh it from the 1. So if you have that strategy that you talk about in impromptu prep and you carry from your first speech, it's going to set you apart. But that leads me perfectly into the last thing, which is what really sets the best teams apart. You can have 4, 5, 3 debaters with the most insane topic knowledge in the whole world, with the fastest writing speed in the whole world. But what really is going to set a team apart is going to be communication. And it's really hard, especially in the debate realm, when you have a lot of strong personalities, a lot of people with very, very large opinions, a lot of people with differing perspectives who all believe, like, who are firmly grounded in their beliefs. So coming into a team environment where you want to succeed as a team and not as an individual, communication is going to be the most important thing. And honestly, this is my hot take, but I think the reason that we won this year was because of how well our team got along. We were basically like a family. We all very much cared about each other, very much supported each other. There was no one that was kind of like separate. And so I think that's something that's really, really important, is respecting your teammates outside of round and being able to communicate with them. Because if you go in thinking, I'm better than all of these people and my ideas are right, my ideas are going to dominate the conversation, that's going to come through at the end. But communication is difficult, but it's something that's really important. So one thing that, again, we were told in Mexico that like kind of struck me in particular was the way you think you sound is not the same as you actually sound, especially in an impromptu setting, because you have an hour to write this case. You have an idea of what you think is right. Your teammates have an idea of what they think is right. You're talking about the debate. You're getting into the heat of it. You're probably going to come off a lot more aggressive than you want to. And so what you have to do is kind of like take a second to think before you're going to give advice or opinions to other people, because there's it's hard when your teammate is going to be giving an idea that maybe you don't think works. Instead of saying, which we'll get to, is like, that doesn't make sense, listen to my idea. Something like that is very critical of your teammate. It's kind of alienating their ideas, making them feel like their voice isn't as important, which means you guys aren't working as a machine. You're working very, very disjointed. So I would just be like very cognizant, very aware of how you're saying things, because you're not debating your teammates, you're debating with your teammates. So make sure that like in that impromptu session, you create a very, very respectful environment, like create a very, very clear boundary between when you're prepping and when you're debating. Otherwise, you risk really, really alienating your teammates. And then again, you won't get that same kind of team unity throughout the round, which is really what makes a team successful, is when they're able to work together. They're all in sync from their first speech all the way to their last. So one thing there is like, don't use dead end statements. This is like a very clear thing to be aware of. Like, never say no. Never say that doesn't make sense. Never say stuff like that. Because those statements don't give you anywhere to go from. If you say like that doesn't make sense, then you're not able to build off of that. Maybe if you ask a question about what they're saying and saying like, why is that the case? Or how does that relate to XYZ? Then you're able to build off of that and get somewhere where you're understanding. If you're saying like, no, or we can't use that, or that doesn't work, or that doesn't make sense, you're alienating your teammates and you can't go anywhere from there. Like, that doesn't get you anywhere that's unified. That doesn't get you anywhere where you guys are understanding each other and working together to like make a good case and make a good argument. Next thing is, if you ever agreed to structure, respect it. If you have somebody who's been appointed as team captain, if you guys decide to do the role things, where someone's a moderator, someone's a devil's advocate, maybe someone's in charge of coming up with examples, someone's in charge of coming up with framing, stuff like that. If you have an agreed structure, agreed roles, agreed time periods, respect it. Even if you don't think it works, even if you don't agree with it, that hour is not the time to be fighting with your teammates. Respect it, move on. If you don't like your role, basically suck it up. Like, you're doing what you're doing for the betterment of the team, not for yourself. And that like ties into the next thing, which is like, respect your teammates and don't be toxic. Don't be gossiping with other people like, oh, that was such a stupid idea, or oh, I can't believe they did that. Because then it's going to show in the way that you guys compete together that you're not like a unified team, that there's strife there. So yeah, don't be toxic. That like really makes the team environment bad. That makes you guys not want to work with each other. That makes you guys want to continue proving each other wrong and not using each other's ideas and kind of like disregarding them. So that's very not good. The next thing is be present. So even if you're not debating, even if you're giving the 3 and you're talking about ideas for the case, take notes during your initial discussions when other people are talking about their ideas. Write them down, think about them, think of ways to expand upon them. Because if you're the 3 and the one has a terrible speech, like, you're not able to like weigh anything. So you need to like make sure everybody's engaged in the process, everybody's taking notes, make sure all ideas are heard and valued. This is the idea that we do of going around, making sure everybody says what they wrote down in that 5-minute prep, because then you're able to kind of merge all the ideas together and make them the best version of themselves. And when people feel valued in a team environment, especially if you're in a leadership position, and you make people feel very valued, they're going to be more productive, they're going to contribute more, they're going to be more excited about what they're doing, and overall, y'all are going to be way more efficient. And then lastly, everybody needs to work hard. Like, that's kind of a given, but if you're not debating, find places that need to be filled. If you're the one and by some miracle you write the case, it's perfect, it's polished early, start talking clash, stuff like that. Be a team player, film where you need to where you need to. Yeah. So with that, I have about 9 minutes left. If I know I just literally talked at y'all for almost a full hour. This is something that's pretty impossible to master. Like you're never going to have an imperfect impromptu prep session. But these are tips that you can apply, things you can try out, good strategies, good things to keep in mind. So if you guys have any questions, I would be happy to answer. Ooh, okay, I got a question on preemptive strikes as a first speaker. Okay, I think that this depends. First, I don't know if you were prop or op. But this depends A on if you're prop or op, and B how you prop. That's what I figured. This depends on how you do it. This can be really effective, or it can be a failure if you like go from your I've seen speakers in like BP especially be like, this is going to be the most important thing in the round, etc., etc., etc. And then it is, and then it's like, wow, how'd they do that? And that comes from being really effective at reverse engineering the round. I think things like that can be very effective if you like preemptively say, this is what we are going to have as our strongest impact down the bench. And then you guys actually execute that well. Doing something on prop where you're like, I know op is going to say X, Y, Z can be harmful, because if they don't say it, then you're spending more time on ground that isn't even relevant to the debate. One thing you can do is in your world's characterization, be very preemptive. So if you say like, we have a world in which, let's go back, we talked about developing countries a lot. Like our world is one where developing countries are able to industrialize in the most effective manner, where they're not blamed for things they weren't harmed for. In opposition's world, they make developing countries pay the price of dirty industrialization that was conducted by Western countries that are already developed in the status quo. Something like that. Like you can do something like that, and then you're preemptively striking against them, preemptively doing some worlds analysis and worlds comparison. And I think that can be beneficial. But I wouldn't spend time on like claims that your opponent could make, because if they don't make it, then you're wasting time. Okay. Next, what should you do outside of competing to improve? Okay. I have several things here. First, read the news. This is something that's, if you don't do it, it's going to be hard to get into like the flow of doing until you make it a habit. Something that always helps me is I like to listen to the NPR daily morning podcast. It's like 12 minutes. I put on 2x speed, and then like when I'm getting ready in the morning, I listen to it. It helps me like get caught up with like current world events. But if you do other debate events, like that research will help you to really just stay as involved as possible in current events, especially like big themes. Like there's always big themes about like economics, technology, feminism, art, literature, stuff like that. That's something else that's interesting about worlds. They have like topics like that. But if you just try and stay very up with current events, you'll probably be prepared there. The second thing that helped me the most was watching WSDC videos. And even like you can watch a little BP too for like college debate, but listening to how like the best of the best are doing it, how they're structuring their arguments, how they're coming up with things, how they're saying things, what they're saying, that helped me more than anything else, and like comparing my own style to them. And then also practice, like do tournaments, put yourself out there, do mock rounds, stuff like that. Like the more you practice, the better off you'll be. Okay, I'm gonna get Santiago first, and I'll answer the rest in the chat.
Hi, so firstly, thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. So I just had a question about speaker roles. Do you think that is something that should be defined later in the impromptu preparation, or something that should be decided beforehand?
Do you mean like the 1, 2, 3, 4?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, that should always be determined beforehand, because if you're talking, arguing about stuff like that in your 60 minutes of prep, you're wasting time. So what we did is we always sent out like we had like I said, like appointed like team captains for each like little segment of 3 to 5 people, and then they would create like rotations to make sure each person was speaking. And we actually did a variety of positions. We didn't lock anything down until WSCC, but in a variety of positions and being able to speak for an even amount of rounds. There were exceptions, very, very rare that somebody was like, I'm going to step out of this round, you step in because you're better suited, and then we'll switch later on to adjust for it. But that's the exception, not the rule. You should have it set before round. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Next question was about POIs. Okay, yes. Answering POIs is something that's tough, especially when you're new to it and you're having somebody like stand up and interrupt your flow of thought in the middle of a speech that you didn't have any prep time to write, and somebody suddenly is standing up yelling POI at you. I would recommend 2 things. First, practice. So practice giving speeches, having somebody stand up, say POI, practice waving them down, stuff like that. Like just getting used to having somebody do that could be very, very helpful doing drills, practicing. Other thing I would note is only take a POI at a time when it's very, very strategic to you. So you want to take a POI, like, what some people do is like they take it in the breaks between their substantive arguments. So it actually like gives them time to catch up with their brain. Some judges don't like that. Some judges like it when you give it in the middle of an argument. It doesn't, I would say if you're struggling, that's a good thing to implement at first, is take them in between subs or take them after framing. So not in the middle of a train of thought, finish up and then take it. And also take it at a time when it's strategic to you. So if there's like, let's say, a nationally ranked debater on the other team and they are throwing POIs at you, and then like their teammate who you never heard of stands up and is like POI, take that one. So there's like, be very strategic about how you answer them. You don't have to take all of them. You get to call the shots. So that's what I would recommend there. Okay. Do you have any advice for setting burdens during impromptu prep or worlds in general? So that's going to depend. That's a tricky question because it depends on the kind of motion. Like the burden for the round is going to be very different in a this house would or a this house regrets or an actor motion. And setting up a burden for the round, I would say when you should talk about it is during framing. So when you're framing for the round, when you're setting your stance, you need to say this is our burden, this is their burden for the round. But you have to frame it in a way that's very charitable to your opponents and is very achievable and defendable, but also is like more favorable for you. So like in the financial settlements case, our burden for that round was we don't have to win every single case. We just have to win one, because then we set a precedent for the future. So that's like a good way of thinking about it. It's like in your framing for the rest of the round, after you've established what your subs are going to be, after you've established like the principle and stuff like that, then you can go back and be like, okay, how are we approaching this? What's our burden? What's their burden? I'll take 2. How much am I? Yeah, it's 7. So I'll take 2 more. So I have, how do you write out an impromptu case? Do you script it? This is a great question. Do you use bullet points or note cards? We on USA we use legal pads. So actually, some people use legal pads. Largely what we do is like it's just sheets of printer paper, and we write it out on those. It's bullet points, mainly writing out the most important claims, most important illustrations, the most important impacts, because you don't have time to write out like a whole paragraph thing. But this really is a preference thing. We do paper because it's easier to fit like a lot of stuff on that big piece of paper than it is to fit stuff on a note card. But Team Singapore, who is amazing, very, very talented, they use note cards. But when you're writing it out, don't write every word you need. Just write the most essential things, because even if you have the time to write out the entire speech, then you're going to be like staring at it the whole time. What you want to be able to do is just look down and glance up and talk to your judge, because you don't want to be too reliant on the stuff that you've written down. Okay, last one. This one, okay, I'm going to take Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna take this one. This is doing world schools, but only having experience in Parley, advice for improving other than flowing and watching rounds. Okay. When I came on to USA, I had zero experience in worlds. My entire experience in worlds was the application process. So I had to come on with the most talented people in the entire country from ground zero, basically. So I got you here. Literally, the thing that helped me the very most was, I know you said other than flowing / watching rounds, but beyond flowing / watching rounds, what you should do is instead of looking at like the flow of the round and the arguments they're making, look at the structure of their arguments. So what I would do is I would literally break down how much time are they spending on their intro, how much time are they spending on framing, how much time are they spending on each sub, how much time are they spending on their impacts, what are they impacting, what things are they weighing / carrying throughout the round. So I focused more on the strategy that they implemented. And the second thing I did was like redos. So if I gave a speech in practice or at a tournament that I didn't like, first what I do is in tournaments, I always recorded. So like there's a little like audio recorder app on your phone. I recorded my speeches, and I would go back and I would, as painful as it is, I would listen to them. I hated every second of it, but I would look for things that I did that I didn't like. I would take notes from my judges, and my coaches, and I would do redos. So I would redo the speech I had done, implementing the advice and send it to them. So they could see like I was working hard, but also for myself, because it helped me improve and actually like concretely implement advice. So I would like not only flow things and listen and practice, but also apply the things that you're learning from that to your own speeches. Because then like if you just like look at rounds and look at what other people are doing, it's not going to be as beneficial as if you're like practicing implementing it. So that is all the time we have, unfortunately. But what I will do is I can put my email, and also Equality and Forensics, they put my Instagram on their story, so y'all can follow me and DM me if you have any other questions. Yeah, make sure I'm going to everyone.